Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing? We'll wait just a few more minutes to start. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelvin. I am currently serving as a Houston organizer for Jolt. We're super excited here to start our next Jolt Talk with Ashley Williams, the education policy analyst from Every Texan. This Jolt Talk is going to be just about pretty much just some policy aspects of just making higher education more affordable. And with us, just a few, just a brief background on Ashley. Ashley joined Every Texan as the higher education policy analyst in 2018 and focuses on college access and affordability with an emphasis on students from historically underrepresented backgrounds. She leads the Every Texan Higher Education Policy Fellowship Program and co-leads the Post-Secondary Advocates Coalition for Equity. She is dedicated to conducting intersectional research and advocating for policies that drive structural equity, communities of color, and women. Ashley holds a Master's of Social Science from UCLA, a Bachelor of Business Administration and Business Honors in Finance, and a Bachelor of Arts in African and African American Diaspora Studies from the University of Texas at Austin. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Kelvin, and thank you to Jolt for having me this evening. Like Kelvin said, my name is Ashley Williams. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the higher education policy analyst at Every Texan. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all today because we know that as we continue to fight the spread of COVID-19 in our communities, our state leaders really should do everything they can to provide the relief that Texans need as they're struggling to get through this crisis. And for the Texas economy to recover, we really need strong public investment in our community colleges, in our universities, and our financial aid programs, because they really form the foundation of opportunity and prosperity for our state. So I just want to talk through a few background items on higher education affordability, and I believe there will be time for questions at the end. So I will share my screen and jump in. So I'm hoping everyone can see the presentation that's on my screen. Today, I want to talk a bit about college affordability, student debt, the historical trends that have created the picture that we see in our state today, a little bit about college access as it relates to affordability, some highlights from our last session, and some opportunities this session as well. And as I mentioned, there will be time for questions at the end. So the cost of college in Texas has really skyrocketed over the past few decades. For four-year universities, that's the graph you're looking at right now, we see a blue line that is trending down and a red line that is trending up. The blue line we're looking at here is, of course, our state appropriations to our public four-year universities or colleges. And that red line we see going up is the cost of tuition and fees that Texas students and families pay to attend college. When our public investments in post-secondary education go down, colleges have to make up for those expenses, and they tend to do so if other opportunities aren't available by raising tuition and fees. So there is a direct relationship, though it is not the only factor, between how much our state contributes and invests in our higher education and how much we pay in tuition and fees. A really important factor that I want to point out here is in 2003, our state legislature voted to deregulate tuition. Before that point, there was a check and a balance on how much Texas public colleges could charge Texas students and families. But our ledge decided that our public colleges could charge as much as they want to Texas students, and it is certainly a part of the factor that we see this tuition and fees line going up so drastically. And another point I'll just mention here is that right around 2009, 2010, that's the first time we see our state appropriations and our tuition and fees contribution sort of even out. And now past that point, it's been drastically different, such that we pay way more in tuition and fees than our state appropriates on a per student basis. And these trends are similar in our Texas 2 years. Something to note about our 2-year colleges, our community colleges in Texas, they're uniquely funded by property taxes, among other sources. In 2005, you can see on this graph, there was a nearly equal contribution between state appropriations and tax collections, et cetera. But we see that the blue line here, the state appropriations line, is going down, and the tuition and fees is increasing over this time period, as well as the tax collections during this time period. So this just drives home the point more and more that how much we pay in tuition and fees, and in community college case, how much we collect in taxes, really is dependent on how much our state invests in our post-secondary education in Texas. And what does that mean, right? If we have less investment in higher ed, how does that impact students? Well, we know it really makes it hard on students. Unmet need, which is essentially the gap between how much a student needs, right, and how much a student is given in financial aid. Unmet need has really increased. It's actually doubled between 2008 and 2016. So if you look at the graph here, the light red on the left is the unmet need with state aid, right? And so we know that state aid, therefore, does really help students meet their needs. And then the more bold red bar is the amount of unmet need without state aid. So in both cases, both back in 2008 and in 2016, there was still serious unmet need, but without state aid, that number is much higher. And we see that in both cases, the unmet need is really increasing and has been increasing over the years. So when you couple that with less investment, more tuition and fees, and more unmet need, we see that students are really facing some difficult challenges in terms of college affordability. Just a basic overview, many of you will know this, but our need-based financial aid programs in Texas are really unique in that not every state has a need-based financial aid program for both 4 years and 2 years. In Texas, we have the Texas Grants program. It is need-based, it's for 4 years. Prior to the 86 ledge, it served about 54% of eligible students. That means almost half of students who were able to demonstrate need were not receiving that support from the state. But after the 86 sledge, after last legislative session, unmet need, investment in Texas grants increased to about 70% of eligible students served. Was really happy to see that change last session, and was hoping that this session would be one in which we could increase the amount of students served even more. But there are, of course, many challenges to that this session. For example, one of the challenges is that Texas grants underwent some cuts in the interim, and so $43 million was cut from the interim budget for Texas grants, and TEOG, the 2-year equivalent in a need-based financial aid program for our state, also underwent $5 million in interim cuts. But it's important to note that not every type of student gets the same level of aid. In general, no types of students really receive enough aid to meet their need. We talked about the real unmet need in the state. But when you look at full-time students at 4 years versus full-time students at 2 years, we see that actually our 2-year full-time students aren't served at the same levels. In 2016, 20% of 4-year full-time students received state aid. compared to 9% of full-time students at our two-year colleges. So neither 20% nor 9% is a great level of students receiving aid, especially when we know that there's so much unmet need. But you can see that there are gaps in between the types of students who receive aid at 4 years versus 2 years. And that's also the case at when you look at full-time students versus part-time students. So 4-year full-time students, about 20% of those students receive state aid. But when you look at part-time students at 4 years in Texas, only about 2% of those students receive state aid. When we think about, perhaps the traditional definition of a student was initially that person that graduates college and goes straight through 4 years full-time and graduates and gets a job. But we know that that's actually not today's student in Texas. A lot of our students are part-time. They go to 2 years and then transfer to 4 years. There are a lot of other paths that our students take, their student parents, and independent students. The list goes on, right? But it's important that we ask ourselves why our financial aid systems are really dealing with an antiquated and rewarding an antiquated view of a student, and not really considering all types of students, such as part-time students or our 2-year students, in the same ways and serving them at the same rates. And this trend of being underserved as non-traditional student continues. When we look at independent versus dependent students back in 2016, full-time dependent students were received about 23%, or 23% of full-time dependent students received state aid. And when you look at full-time independent students, that number is about 5%. So our students who are emancipated from their parents, older, and other areas that qualify them as independent, they're also not receiving the same levels of state aid as our dependent students in Texas. And one would think that if you are an independent student, if you're relying primarily or exclusively on your own resources, you might need even more support. So it seems counterintuitive to see these trends. Yeah, that's what we see. Our non-traditional students in Texas really aren't met in our state aid programs in the same way, though all of our programs overall, as we've seen, are being less funded in general, and unmet need across the board is increasing. And when we look at different types of public institutions in Texas, we see even more of a difference in the type of funding and support that students get. When we look at our public HBCUs in Texas, that's Prairie View A&M University and Texas Southern University, about 63 to 66% of students demonstrate financial need, right? And that's compared to our sort of flagship universities, University of Texas at Austin and Texas A&M University, where about a quarter of those students demonstrate financial need. When you look at the average debt upon graduation, though, we see that there's more debt at our public HBCUs than our public flagships. But when you look at the total funds per full-time student equivalent, FTSE, we see that our public HBCUs don't receive the same amount from this apples to apples comparison of our state appropriations. Our public HBCUs don't receive the same amount per student as our public flagships. You see University of Texas per FTSE appropriations being at about 43%, 44,000 compared to 18 and 20,000 at Texas Southern and Prairie View A&M respectively. And so when we go back here and we think about, okay, our public HBCUs are serving students with high financial need relative to our public flagships, receiving less funds per FTSE from the state. Not to say that all the campuses aren't doing what they can to invest in their students. We have to ask ourselves, what's going on here? What's wrong? And how can we fix this to create a more equitable public funding system for our higher education systems? And then another thing I'll point out here is that the percent of total funds spent on student services and scholarships at our public HBCUs is actually higher in both cases for Prairie View and A&M than Prairie View A&M and Texas Southern than UT and Texas A&M. We're seeing 16 to 21% versus 8 to 12% at our public flagships. So our public HBCUs are serving students who have higher need, or more percentage of students with higher need, and they're taking this money and they're putting it back in the pockets of students in terms of student services and scholarships at a higher rate. Yet they're getting fewer funds per full-time student equivalent per student. And again, we just really want to take a step back and ask ourselves why that is and what we can do really to make some changes there. Another important program that I want to highlight, because I think Texas really got it right. Back in 2003, as many of you probably know, Texas was the first state to pass a statewide DREAM Act that allowed in-state tuition and financial aid for undocumented students and now documented students as well. There are some qualifications for the Texas DREAM Act. This may be reviewed for many of you, but students who lived in the state 3 years before graduating, they lived in the state for the full year before the cutoff, and sign an affidavit of intention to apply for lawful permanent status as soon as one is able. Those are sort of the qualifications for this Texas DREAM Act program. And it's important to note that while there are many, many reasons beyond just financial and economic considerations for having a great program like this in our state, it is important to note that our Texas DREAM Act students contribute much more financially than they receive, right? The tuition and fees paid by Texas DREAM Act students per year in 2016 were about $64 million. And in comparison, about $12 million was received by those students in state-funded grant programs. So again, there are many other reasons to keep this program, but I think it's important to know and quell any misconceptions. Our Texas DREAM Act students are contributing to our higher education system at a much higher rate than they're served. And I mean, I would submit that that's an issue in itself, but it's really important to understand the benefits of this program and how it actually bears out in practice. And so as we have bills even this session and frequently every session to repeal in-state tuition, to repeal our Texas DREAM Act, like HB 1486 and other bills that would threaten the lived experience, the lives of students really on campuses, like HB 3589. I worry and I'm concerned, and I hope that we all are worried and concerned as really great programs that Texas was actually a leader in creating initially are under threat even this session. And I guess it's important also to mention that, you know, college education, having a bachelor's degree really improves earning potential for Texans, especially Texas immigrants, or also in the case of Texas immigrants. And we know that investments in our fellow Texans means better earning potential and opportunity, and ultimately more prosperity in our state as a whole. So looking back at our last legislative session, the 86th Ledge, to kind of think about what went well there and set the stage for what's going on now. Back during last session, we had an increased focus and investment in adult learners, which when we think about the differences or lack of investment in non-traditional students that I mentioned before, that was something I was very happy to see last session, understanding that adult learners are important parts of our state and they should be invested in to enter the education education pipeline. So we had a subsidized high school equivalency exam put into HB3 last session. So exams like the GRE, HiSET, and TASC, not all of them are still active in Texas these days, but excuse me, I said GRE, I meant, and now I'm blanking on the name, forgive me y'all, but the exams that you take to get your GED, thank goodness they came to me. But when you think about getting your GED and you take the exam and you get credit for your high school diploma, a high school equivalency, it used to be prior to last session that one, you had to pay for it yourself. After the last session, we now know that there's opportunities for that to be subsidized by the state. But now high school equivalency exams can also count for college readiness standards. So prior to last session, a person would study really hard, find childcare, invest their time and resources to study for the GED, just to have to take yet another exam to be counted as college ready in Texas. And last session, Texas changed such that folks who got high scores on high school equivalency exams could then automatically be counted as college ready based on the standards set by the coordinating board. So adult learners really made a lot of strides last session, and there's also a study to really see the outcomes and really hone in on what adult learners are getting from these opportunities that has been put into motion as well after last session. And I think that this session, there are also a lot of focuses on adult learners, and that is continuing and is positive. As we know, non-traditional students, not quote unquote non-traditional students, the majority of students in Texas these days do need more focus and more investments. Also, the Texas application for student aid became electronic, or became available or able to be available online. I know there's still some implementation there, but it used to be that to fill out a Texas application for student aid to get perhaps benefit from the Texas Dream Act, or to get the application for need-based aid only in the state only, you had to fill out like an actual paper and go through a lot of hoops to get those TAFSA applications to campuses. And after last session, they implemented an electronic TAFSA process. So that's also really positive, and hopefully once implemented fully will make the application more accessible for Texans. And we also, as I mentioned, saw increased investments in need-based aid. So the increase of investment in the Texas Grants program last session, from about 54% of eligible students served to 70% of eligible students served, was really, really promising. And I do recall soon after last session, folks saying that this session would be the higher education session. But of course, with everything going on, there is still a lot of care and focus for interested parties on higher education, and there should absolutely be. focus particularly on the funding of our higher education system, because it's not necessarily mandated at a level that all higher education is, funded at least X number in our state. Our higher education budget tends to take a hit in times of economic struggle, which we certainly have seen and are seeing right now. So now is the time to be really active and watching our ledge and looking at the process and seeing how our legislators are investing in higher education, because students cannot bear any more of the trend that I showed before, where state appropriations are going down even more and tuition and fees are going up. And what is beyond that tuition and fees going up as state appropriations go down is that student debt is also skyrocketing in Texas, right? Texas students and families haven't had an equal increase. And I'll go back, forgive me, I'll go back to this because I think it's important. Texas students and families haven't seen their income increase in the same way that this red line is going up here, right? So how do Texas students and families meet the needs of financing a higher education in Texas? Well, they end up having to borrow or end up having to forego post-secondary education altogether. And so there's a direct relation between the amount of burden on students and families and the state's investment in higher education. So one thing that this session I will be watching closely, I hope we are all watching closely, is what our legislators do to invest in our higher education, because this trend really has weighed heavily on so many of us. So many of us have talked about the student debt burdens and real lived experiences that happen from that. So yeah, that's one thing I'm really focusing on this session, is what our state appropriations are going to look like, because it will impact our tuition fees and ultimately the debt picture in Texas. Forgive me, I'll go back to where I was. So yeah, we also saw college promise and tuition re-regulation policies considered last session. So college promise programs or free college programs, you all are probably familiar with those. There are many models of free college and college promise across the country. And there have been and are still proposals, excuse me. There have been and are now even the session proposals to move towards the college promise model for the state. And other types of versions of that. There's also been consideration of tuition re-regulation, right? So I talked about in 2003, our legislators decided to deregulate tuition, allowing public colleges to charge unlimited tuition. Well, last session, there were considerations of, what would it look like to re-implement that check and that balance on the amount of tuition and fees that Texas students and families are paying. And I believe that there are even bills of session filed to do the same thing. There are a lot of factors that have to be considered there, right? But, I think personally that it is a positive change if we could find a way to effectively and thoughtfully put some checks and balances on how much Texas students and families are paying, and at the same time investing in our post-secondary education in Texas so that there are no significant gaps left. And then in addition to college affordability, I mentioned how closely tied the amount we pay for college in Texas and the amount of debt we hold, of course, is. Last session, there was a really great bill passed to stop people who were losing their professional licenses because of student debt default from doing so. So before last session, if you were a nurse or a social worker, or you had some sort of professional license in Texas and you defaulted on your student debt, you could actually lose your professional license and therefore your ability to pay your debt, right? It didn't make any sense. And so I was really glad last session to see that change occur to where that was no longer happening, or it does no longer happen. And I'd say that this legislative session, I am excited about, again, funding for our post-secondary education, our public colleges, both 2 years and 4 years. I really am excited to see our legislature hopefully invest and double down on its investment in our students and families in Texas, and really in the prosperity for our future. I'm excited to see programs that consider students as they are going through and dealing with all of the fallout from COVID-19, and things like emergency aid are also really, really important this session as well. I will stop there with my official sort of comments, but I really do want to open up for questions. I'd love to hear from you all. The mute button gets you every time. So one question I see here is, what can be done in order to stop the Texas Dream Act from being repealed? I think one thing that we should all be doing if we care about this critical program, and I know I do, I hope you do as well, is talking to your legislators and letting them know how important it is that this program is protected, and that these kinds of threats to these critical programs for our state are not allowed to prosper this legislative session or in any future session, right? So really just reaching out, making your voice heard, both to your legislator and to especially the higher education committees, both in the House and Senate. And if you want to reference a particular bills that are harmful, in my opinion, to undocumented and documented students, you can look at HB 1486 and HB 3589. And I know in our coalition, we Every Texan, Young Invincibles, Jolt, MALDEF, IDRA, a lot of organizations are working on this issue as well. And I know that, if you're in touch with them, we will be continuing to work to stop that effort as well. I think this is an interesting question. So how can we organize at a collegiate level to communicate with school officials that we would like tuition decreases? So I will say that I'm, one, not a student on a campus right now, or particularly an expert in campus level interventions. But, I guess the theme of all my answers is going to be make your voice heard, because at the end of the day, especially our universities, our colleges have a big sway. They have a voice in the process, and so do you as a student. Also, I want to point out, student, even if you are a student, I want you to be clear, and I know that Jolt says as much as so well, that like you can call yourself, you can bypass your university, you can call your legislator, the person that represents you, yourself, or if we were in person, you'd be able to walk into their office and talk to them about it. But you can certainly call your legislators, email them directly, and let them know that how much you pay, your tuition and fees, that's important to you, and you want to see investments in higher education so that you don't see any more increases. But I think communicating that message super clearly to your colleges and universities, and I think they know that students do not want to see any more tuition increases, but like finding ways to partner with universities and colleges to be voices together at the ledge, to again advocate for more investment in post-secondary education in Texas, I think is a really great first step. I know when I was on campus, I wasn't as advanced as students are these days and as organizers are these days. And I always saw the university itself as a site of change, which it absolutely is. And, even beyond the appropriations this session, there are still decisions that will be made on college campuses about budgets. And so I also encourage involvement in that budget process. I know it looks different from campus to campus, but finding out how your campus does the budget. Okay, so the state appropriates a certain amount, but how your campus allocates that amount, I really encourage engaging in that process and being really active around it and making your voice heard around it. But also, I think I didn't understand as a student, and though I know many of you students do and you're more advanced, but I didn't understand that I truly had a voice at the ledge and that my voice was really important to the process. So I encourage you all to use that voice, and I know Jolt tells you all how to do that so well. Awesome, y'all. Well, I really am thankful for the time we've been able to spend together, and I want you to know that I'm always a resource. Please feel free to reach out to me directly. You can email me at williams@everytexan.org if you want to continue these conversations or have further questions. And thank you so much again to Jolt for creating some space for us to have this conversation today.